I was born just after the war, and for me and my contemporaries, Hitler was the ultimate bogey figure, the incarnation of the devil, and all our parents had been involved in the war in one way or another, and never stopped talking about him. So for kids growing up in the 50s, even kids who would not have regarded themselves as particularly intellectual or academic, we had a rather good working knowledge of Hitler and his Confederates, and of the battles and campaigns of the Second World War. I find that now I have a reasonably academic 14-year-old son, and I find that with him and his contemporaries, Hitler has faded into being a rather remote figure, say, as Napoleon might have been when we were kids. In fact, we were probably in time closer even to Kaiser's Germany than kids of the 1990s are to Hitler's Germany. But I'd like to transpose that idea of Hitler as the ultimate bogey figure to a rather more sophisticated or rather more crucial level. To look at his role only half acknowledged in the Cold War. The other thing, of course, that was familiar to anyone who's grown up in the 1950s, and indeed probably to most people alive today even, because it went on to the late 1980s, was the Cold War. Now, the Cold War, you might say, rose up on the ashes of Hitler, you know. Hitler was what the Russians and the West could ultimately agree on, that they had to sink their considerable differences to defeat the Nazis. And surely all they were doing was squabbling about the Nazi inheritance. But they divided Europe into two armed camps. But I think the experience of fighting Hitler and the Nazis was so profound, particularly for the Soviet Union, that during the Cold War, the Nazi motif coloured each side's perception of each other. And we've all, in the West, we all lived through the propaganda that the communist regime, with their occupation of Eastern Europe, were the heirs of the Nazis. Okay, unless you were a complete illiterate or completely ideologically unsophisticated, you realize that the ideology of the Soviet Union was rather different from the Nazi ideology. But you could say, at a sort of semi-sophisticated level, yes, but the methods are the same, and the fact that you have one ideology which everyone must obey is similar. And, you know, they have secret police armies, concentration camps and the rest of it. So that was often the way the West looked at the Soviet Union. Now, how much truth was there in it, or how valid was this comparison between the Soviets and the Nazis of a decade or so earlier? Well, you can say there were certain, even if you try and put the propaganda aside, you can say there were certain plausible analogies. Stalin, for example, although a different sort of dictator, could even be argued to have been worse than Hitler in the sense that he lived longer, had more time to kill people. He had, even in the 1930s, his concentration camps, is often forgotten, were in fact much bigger and contained many more people than Hitler's did in the 1930s. Note, I'm not talking about the war period. There's that sort of thing, and it's true that the Soviet Union was totalitarian. But, of course, to compare the Nazi regime to the Soviet regime is, in many ways, many important ways, of course, very misleading. Perhaps even Stalin, an anecdote about Stalin may illustrate this, that sometime in the early 50s, or whenever, Stalin received Eden, Anton Eden, who was either the British Foreign Minister, British Shadow Foreign Minister. This was at the time of just after the greatest expansion of Soviet Russia, taken over from Hitler, if you like, in Eastern Europe. And there's things like the blockade of Berlin, which has been seen of. And Stalin said to Hitler, Stalin said to Eden, "You think I'm just like Hitler, don't you? But I'm not. I know when to stop." And that is true. I think Stalin had learnt the lesson from Hitler that what had brought Hitler down was not stopping. If we bother to look at it, Hitler, you see, was astonishingly successful up to the including the takeover of Czechoslovakia, or Prague, not just Munich, but the takeover of the Czech parts of Bohemian Moravia in 1939. He'd got away with everything. Then the invasion of Poland, in the end he found he'd bitten off more than he can chew. So I think Stalin was learning from that. Stalin would try it on. He did the blockade of Berlin in 1948, trying to force the Western Allies out of Western Berlin, i.e. take over the whole city, although by the agreement made a couple of years earlier with the Russians, they had a perfect right to be there. On the other hand, he gave up when he found it wouldn't work. Another thing is that Stalin did not back the Greek communists in the civil war going on in the late 40s, same time, to the height, because there had been an agreement that the Russians could take over, say, essentially Bulgaria, Hungary and Romania, but Greece would remain in the Western sphere of influence. And also Stalin knew how, because of the experience of fighting the Nazis, which had a devastating effect on the Soviet Union, that there could be no war. A war with the West might finish Russia off, but have no good effect on the West, obviously. And with Russia, it might be the end. Excuse me. What about? So that is the colouring of the Western perception of Russia by the Nazi experience is exaggerated. What did the Russians think? Well, to the Russians, invasion comes from the West, and it had come several times. In 2 long lives. You start off with the Napoleonic invasion, 1811. You get the Crimean War, 1854-56. You get the intervention of the Western powers and the Japanese against the Bolshevik Revolution, 1918-21. Then you get the great revanchist German invasion. Oh, I should have mentioned, that even before the Bolshevik Revolution, the Germans had, of course, the Imperial Germany had invaded Russia. And in fact, the Imperial Germans won on the Russian front, which is one reason why Hitler's gamble 25 years later wasn't so crazy. Imperial Germany had forced the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on the new Bolshevik regime in 1918. Reason why this didn't last is the Germans lost overall on the Western Front. Anyway, and then finally you get this the most savage invasion of all, the Nazi invasion. So Russia feared that the West might do the same thing again, and it was not too difficult to assimilate Hitler's regime to the more respectable, seemingly Western bourgeois democracies which succeeded, even in Germany, America, France. Why was that? The average Westerner would be horrified to be assimilated to Hitler. But you've got to look at things from the communist point of view. The communists had their own sort of crude propaganda. Anyone who wasn't a communist was really a social fascist. And democratic socialists, like the Labour Party or the German Social Democratic Party, were considered the worst of all, because while any intelligent worker could see that a capitalist party like the Tories were capitalist and behave accordingly, the Labour Party or the German SPD were deceiving the workers with false socialism. They were false prophets, just while really being lackeys of the capitalists. So the communists had this idea of social fascists, and they would point out, well, the West is essentially capitalist with a facade of liberal participatory democracy, but then Hitler's regime, according to communist ideas, was really a desperate attempt to shore up German capitalism. And German capitalism and rich people flourished under Hitler. So they would regard Nazism as an extreme attempt to defend anti-communist values. When you can no longer be respectable and have a facade of bourgeois democracy, you go to outright fascism. But really, what was there before Hitler, and in the West, what was there after Hitler? The capitalist regimes would be considered to be a softer, more civilized version of fascism. They certainly were not bringing social justice Soviet style as the Soviets conceived it, and really their hatred of communism was not much less than Hitler's. In fact, there's some objective verification if you hear American Republicans talk about communism. So they regarded Western democracy as a hypocritical facade. The Russians would also point to the fact that in Germany itself, hordes of people who collaborated very actively with the Nazi regime, in fact, been Nazi Party members, had been sanitized, dusted down, and given important positions in to run West Germany after the war, when West Germany got its army back, I think in the mid-1950s, of course. The core of the army officers were, and had to be, people who'd served in Hitler's armies. Who else could they be? And so on. And for a long time, Nazis in West German society have always been unmasked. Former Nazis who'd done something awful. It's passed away now because you'd have to be very old to have been active in the Hitler side. What about former Nazis in East Germany? Well, there were actually plenty run in East Germany as well, but officially there weren't. Officially that wasn't true. It was only West Germany which had Nazis. Then the Americans and British were given stick, of course, for tolerating or not punishing, former German Nazis. So, in both cases, the analogy with totalitarianism, death camps and dictatorship, which the West made between Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany, was very powerful. The analogy of capitalism, inequality and exploitation, and also the age-old wish of the West to invade Russia and really do for Russia, which is what the Soviets, the analogy the Soviets made between the Nazi regime and the Western capitalist democracies, were very powerful, I think, for both parties.